Hey everybody, welcome back to Parkitect campaign mode. Now today it's time to look at Western Roundup, and the description is that it's an old Wild West town that's seen better days. If you can get past the heat, there's lots of space for a large amusement park. So apparently there's probably some bit of a weather challenge to this park, so we might need to sell a lot of drinks or provide a lot of shade. That's something to look into. It's a little bit more difficult than Victoria Lake, it seems, since we have to get 500 guests, which is the highest goal so far, as well as a happiness rating of 75%, and that's the only part which concerns me maybe a little bit, since the park tickets, you'll sell that kind of goal at some point anyway, so that's not too difficult. But then the happiness rating, I haven't actually looked at it so far, and I assume that my parks so far have done alright on this, but I'm not entirely sure. So yeah, let's just get into it and try to see what the theming so far is like. This is one of the scenarios which I also didn't make. This was made by Josh. So I'm gonna try my best to sort of emulate the look of the western town which we have so far. But really it's very much just to give you a start and a bit of an idea of what you can do with the theme. But aside from that, it's not really giving any challenges with the terrain or the scenery. It's pretty much an empty sandbox. So I think that's a good start. I think I can work with this. The rides are pretty limited though, so I think I'm going to want to research thrill rides, get a little bit more of that. I'm not too concerned about the calm rides because they don't earn as much money and get as many guests in as the other rides, I believe. So that'll be something to focus on. I just saw a lot of roller coasters, so that's definitely something to experiment with. It would be really nice to build something like a themed mine train at some point when I get the money. And maybe a small junior coaster again, although a wild mouse is also very often a western themed ride as well, so we'll see what I can do with that. In any case, let's get into the time lapse. Alright, now Joshua did an excellent job on the existing scenery, so I'm just gonna try and do my best to fit the stuff that I build in with a similar sort of theme. Although I did want to add an extra bunch of benches and litter bins for practical purposes. Also pay attention to this queue line which I'm placing right now, because I'm gonna forget to hook this up to any path for the next 10 minutes. So yeah, if you're cringing at this, then I will be too. Don't worry, we're in this together. I will hook that thing up eventually. The time will come once I finally get the park running. I also got a comment about my queues on the last video by King RCT3. Actually, it was the video before that, but I didn't have time to address it in the last video, so here it goes anyway. He was talking about how I don't make my queues obvious enough. Like, a queue entrance should be something that you make quite a bold statement in the landscape, so to speak. A really obvious and big sort of thing to attract guests into, and I tended to hide my queues sort of in the back of the ride and not make the entrance very visible, so that's something I should definitely work on. But for now, I think for these kinds of simple flat rides, I'm just sticking the queues in the entrance, the exits and the entrance next to each other and just alongside the ride, and I think it should be more or less fine that way. In this case, I decided to put a simple cover over the queue and the rocks at the back of the ride, a little bit inspired by the one ride in Slagharen, which people who know the park in the Netherlands probably know what I'm talking about. It's the one with the rocks that look like meatballs with cowboy hats. So I think it's a nice way to theme a flat ride like this, especially if you have that western theme. Just put some rocks to the back of it, make it seem a bit of a canyon-like setting, and that can pretty much work for a cheap and easy way to theme a ride. Now over here I decided to move into the main streets, and it's a bit peculiar, I suppose, that you don't get into the main street right away after you enter the park, but I guess it sort of more or less works. The path just does a few different things before you move into the real main street, and this is where all of the frontier style houses are gonna be, and I have to be completely honest, this is a theme which I've rarely ever done. I think throughout all of my Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 and Planet Coaster and Parkitect videos, I've never done a western themed ride or park or any section of a park even. So I'm a little bit inexperienced when it comes to this stuff, to be very honest, so I looked up just a bunch of reference images and went from there. I think the one thing that does make my life a little bit easier is that western tends to be a really simple theme anyway. because obviously the settlers didn't have all of the resources, so their houses tended to be quite simple, and they're quite boxy and made out of simple materials as well. And I think that reflects in a theme park sense as well. Very often you'll see that small local parks have Western themed areas or are completely Western themed, as in the case of Silvarret, because of the characteristics of a Western theme, they're super cheap and easy to build for parks as well. So I think there's an overrepresentation of Western themed areas in small family parks, just because it's a very cheap theme to build. And because of that, there's a lot of reference for it, so that's nice at least. I know there's the example of Silvarret, but there's lots of different parks as well. That even if they aren't exactly entirely Western themed, they always have this one little area, and then there's a good place to put a saloon as well and sell some American fast food or something like that. But maybe that's also a bit more of a European theme. I'm sure you don't really find this sort of stuff as much in America unless you're looking at actual authentic theme parks like Dollywood and Silver Dollar City. In any case, I decided to go for the stereotypical Western theme for these buildings, so they're just wooden boxes with slightly more detailed and fancy facades at the front in different kinds of colors, because I do want to bring a little bit of color into the scenario. I'm very much afraid that with the color for the terraforming and the paths and even the rock work and the buildings so far, everything is going to be too brown, so I do want to avoid a complete monotony when it comes to the color. So a few colored Western buildings, I think, should help with that as well. Now over here is the third flat ride. I actually connected the queue for this one, so I'm very proud of myself. And I decided to just put a roof over the queue as well as a path which leads to a future area of the park. I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to do with that yet. I'm going to be building an extra flat ride there in a minute, but that's not entirely what I am planning to end up doing with that in the future. But we'll have to see. I think I mostly tend to sort of plan my parks in my head based on where the coasters are going to be and how the coasters are going to be laid out, because you can always sort of wiggle some flat rides here and there, but it's when you build the coasters that you really need to sort of think about your layouts a little bit more. To address some of the questions in the comments as well, I had some questions on the last video also on how I just come up with, in general, theme park layouts and how I pretty much do it just on the fly. And it's a bit of a difficult question for me to answer because there's not so much a method to it, I think. There's just a lot of tricks that I've learned throughout the years, I suppose, of playing Roller Coaster Tycoon and playing Parkitect and similar games like that. I mean, I've played these kinds of games for way too much right now. Like, I've got a few hundred hours in Parkitect, which isn't too much, but I'm sure if you count my hours in the different Roller Coaster Tycoon games, we're counting many thousands of hours at this point. So I think a lot of it is just down to that sort of experience, but there's definitely some things to keep in mind. I think one of the easiest tricks is to have extra wide paths and mix up the path textures a little bit. In Parkitect specifically, I always like to put fences in the middle of the paths so that it splits up the path into different parts where you can put more lights and more benches and more everything. And then a lot of it is also just down to putting some furniture into the paths. No matter how nice looking your layout might be, if your paths are completely empty, it's not going to end up looking very charming or inviting. So over here, for example, I'm putting the string lights over the path, lots of benches, lots of lamps. Wherever I can, some planters and litter bins, and sometimes even some clutter as well. It depends on the theme, what can work, but in this scenario I'm just adding some random barrels and crates everywhere, like I'm some kind of video game designer. But yeah, stuff like that I think also works out quite nicely. And it's also different kind of pathing, like path layouts, I think, for different kinds of areas. So over here, for instance, we have a main street, so it's 3 tiles wide with some planters in the middle. That works for that kind of case, but outside of a main street, I would normally want to avoid something like that. I think 2 tile wide paths are just about enough in Parkitect. 1 tile is a little bit too small. You can use that for little paths somewhere or small shortcuts. But for the bulk of guests, I think 2 tile wide and then filling it up with all kinds of objects is good enough. So yeah, there's that short talk. Now over here is where I decided to build the Gravitron with a bit more of a fitting color scheme, pretty rustic and pretty warm colors like everything else in the park so far, and trying to emulate the sort of surrounding scenery that the carousel had, just in a different way here with these supports. And it's a pretty Western style of doing the pillars, the wooden pillars I think as well, where you have all of these cross beams, these diagonal beams supporting them. I don't know, it just reminds me of a Western kind of look. So there's that. And over here I decided to finish the main street. I actually forgot to put an extra path between those two planters, so the space between them is 1 tile instead of 2 tiles, but I think it works alright. So here's the coaster that I decided to build. I thought about building a wooden coaster and actually tried that for a little bit, but I quickly threw away that idea because it turned way too expensive and I didn't quite get the ratings that I wanted. Because this coaster, it's going to be themed for sure, and it's not purely here for any kind of, well, gameplay reason, but I needed a roller coaster really badly. I didn't have anything with high ratings, and I didn't have any ride which attracts a lot of guests, so far it's been really quiet in the park, and the Wild Mouse coaster is great for being super compact, easy to build, being very cheap, and giving you pretty high stats also for how small it is. It's a pretty easy ride to get medium or even a high intensity on, so this is what I decided to build. I should also say it really fits the Western theme as well, I think. These things also tend to be very common in these parks with Western themes. Some examples I think that come up in my head is Hansa Park in Germany. I know Slagharen, no actually Bobbejaanland in Belgium, which also has a sort of Western theme in that area, has one of these as well. And there are loads of examples like that. They are really great for real life theme parks for the exact same reasons that I just mentioned as well. So yeah, altogether, I think it's a pretty good fit for the park. I had to make the queue extremely long, although that said, from a realism standpoint, it's actually just about what a Wild Mouse coaster needs. So it's not too bad. And it also allows for some interaction between the queue and the coaster itself, and for some more scenery, so I actually kind of like having the queue down there. It was mostly inspired by the queue of Hansa Park's Wild Mouse, which has a similar sort of section where it goes between the layout of the coaster itself, and it's always nice because it gives you some time when you're standing in the queue to look at the coaster go around and basically fear for your life as you're about to ride one of the most uncomfortable coasters ever. But hey, that's what Wild Mouse coasters are all about. Oh, and there's one thing that I forgot to mention. This is a Wild Mouse type coaster, but I decided to swap out the regular cars for the minecart cars, which pretty much perfectly fits the Western theme as well. So that's another part of this ride which I think fits the scenario very much. But then again, that's not really so much my choice, but definitely on the guys from Parkitect themselves. I don't know if it was Joshua who did this, or if the research in this map was added later on by the Parkitect guys themselves. I think it was actually. But you can definitely tell that all the rides that we're getting in this scenario are at least loosely Western themed. So we've got the mine train and the mine carts on the Wild Mouse and the wooden coaster. A junior coaster, because you always have one of those things. But overall, it's a pretty thematic bunch of rides, I think. So yeah, there's that. I think it also has some interesting interaction with the station building, because you always have that one part where it sort of loops back over the station, and I thought it'd be nice to put a little tower in the middle of the station and have the top part of the track go through that, and then another part of the track is moving over that sort of wooden porch that extends on the back of the station building. So yeah, altogether, it's a pretty nice and easy way to get some interaction between the coaster, the paths, and the scenery. Now that'll be it for this Wild Mouse coaster. So even though the surrounding area isn't very much finished yet, I suggest that we go into a quick real-time section to see how the park itself is doing management-wise. Alright, now the park is definitely not doing too shabby. In fact, it's doing way too well. I'm already making $500 a month, which is... oh, make that $600, I suppose. But most of it is actually coming from this little ride over here, which is making some really good money here. This one, not so much actually. The carousel is doing pretty average, as those things do. This is where I hooked up the queue. So there's that spike. So the jumper is going to do alright eventually. And this ride is doing pretty fine as well. I actually forgot to open this one for quite a while. So even though I was not quite in the right mindset to get this park to run alright, I think this coaster is single-handedly saving me. So I think it was a great idea to get that loan, because I am building this thing and everything else I build around here on a loan. But it was definitely a good idea to do that, because that's what I needed to actually run a profit here. Now, the idea is to build some kind of centerpiece building over here, a weenie, if you will. Maybe another building over here, I'm not quite sure what. And then expand into different territories elsewhere. So possibly I could build a wooden coaster along here, but I'm not quite sure if I want to. I'm thinking more something along the lines of a family coaster, since this is sort of the entrance-ish area, and there's lots of gentle-ish rides over here. And yeah, I could maybe put a wooden coaster somewhere in this part of the park. I'm not entirely sure yet. I'll just come up with some things during the time lapse. But yeah, there isn't too much to talk about. No vandals or any other such issues. I'm doing quite alright when it comes to the decoration. Although, looking at it this way, I will need to repair some stuff. So maybe get a little bit more stuff. Get some janitors here and there. And maybe an extra mechanic to fix some of the vandals that I do get. But overall, I seem to be doing more or less fine, so there's not really much to worry about, except maybe negative news about theme parks, I suppose. But yeah, overall, we're doing pretty well. I also think the weather isn't really much of a challenge at all, like I expected. There doesn't seem to be any problems with weather. It just means that I don't get any rain, which is actually perfect. So maybe I do get a little bit of rain, but it's a little bit less challenging since there's less rain and there's less things to worry about when it comes to getting rain coverage and getting rides that people will want to ride when it's raining. So yeah, doing all good. Let's go into the time lapse again and build some stuff. Alright, so I know that I said earlier that I would put some kind of weenie or something interesting at the end of the main street, but in the end I didn't really think anything would fit there. I think these towns are typically all just quite cheap and simple buildings, so I'm just gonna stick to the same style as the rest of the main street, finish it off with some very similar buildings. Although what I did realize, and this probably refers to a point I've talked about earlier in one of my videos, I like to sort of have an idea of a certain color scheme to use throughout a park, but I do like to mix it up as much as I can as well. So what you'll probably see me do a lot, even though everything's going really fast in a time lapse, is using the pipette tool to copy a color from a previous building, but then just slightly shifting the color of it. Which I think is just interesting because it means you can have sort of similar colors throughout the different buildings that mean that they all fit together quite well, but at the same time the colors are ever so slightly different, so you don't get the feeling that all of them are default colors. Because we have such an amazing freedom in what kind of colors we choose in Parkitect, I feel like it would be a waste to not make use of that. So these buildings, again, are just going to be pretty simple facades with different wooden boards and really not too much detail. And this is something where I really have to hold myself back as well, because I really like detailing buildings a lot. But in this case, I'm just going to have to choose every detail that I place very carefully, instead of just adding endless details everywhere. I think I also forgot to put some doors and windows on the ground floor, which is a bit annoying because I now put some roofs over there, so I can't exactly tell where I've built stuff and where I haven't. Which is just a thing because I like to keep playing in isometric mode. I know a lot of people like to play the game in 3D, but I do prefer it in isometric to get that sort of classic feeling of a theme park sim. But yeah, I might have to return to that at some other points, because I'm pretty sure the walls on the ground floor are pretty much just walls at the moment. But yeah, that shouldn't be too much of an issue. And then the yellow building on the corner there is a bit of an end to the main street, I suppose, because I really do want to keep things simple. I was thinking about some kind of centerpiece here, like a gallows or something, but nothing really worked out, so I just ended up putting a tree over there. Speaking of which, I do realize that I have a lot of trees in this park, especially considering the setting is pretty much a desert, but I would just like to stay within that sort of suspense of disbelief that this is a theme park after all, and they're probably gonna have some trees, even if it is very high maintenance and you wouldn't really see it in a natural surrounding. It's just something that makes the park look a little bit nicer, and even though I'm gonna use them sparingly to keep the idea of the theme intact, I do wanna have some trees here and there. It would look very dead and desolate without all of those trees. But I'm also sticking to ones that I feel like they would do alright in this very arid climate, so I don't want to go too far there. So it's all just gonna stick to pine trees, and one of the things that I also really like is that you can subtly change the color of trees as well, so I'm trying to desaturate all of the trees and make them a little bit more grey and darkish than their standard colors, which is always a nice trick as well. I think you can give trees really ridiculous colors to have some kind of effect of like an alien planet, or make them white in a snowy biome. Stuff like that is always interesting. So yeah, there's that. Now over here I'm moving into another junior coaster, and these are already becoming a bit of a staple of almost every single park that I'm making, and I'm almost getting used to building these things. There's always very similar sort of strategy to it, just trying to create all these different helices and very sort of mild layouts that sort of weaves in and out of itself, and that's really all there is to it. So I'm trying to get as much variation with these things as I can, but they are starting to look alike a little bit. But god, they just work really well, and realistically they are present in so many different theme parks that I want to try and get them in as many of these scenarios as I can as possible as well. So yeah, there's that. So that's why I'm building this thing again. And it's always a bit of a puzzle to get back to the station over here, but I think in the end this layout with the two curves sort of stacked on top of each other is pretty much, well, perfect. I wouldn't really be able to improve too much about it, I think, and it's personally my favorite junior coaster layouts so far. We'll see what I get to in the future, but I think it works quite alright. And I just turned it into a blueprint really quickly there, just to move it around, which I would also give to anybody as a tip. It's really easy to just blueprint a ride really quickly if you just want to move it or something like that. Or have a half unfinished ride that you want to move to a different location before you finish it, which is something that I ended up doing later in this episode, but I'm not going to spoil anything yet. It's just a quick tip. And then for the station, I'm just sticking to the style that was more or less put into the park by Joshua, and have these log pillars that hold up the roof, which I think is really nice as well. I feel like the effect which they give you is of slightly overhanging roofs, which is nice because Parkitect doesn't have any overhanging roofs. I know there's some kind of mod, and I'm not quite sure what it's called, but it's something anarchy, I think, that allows you to put grid items on off-grid positions, but in the case of vanilla Parkitect, the roofs and walls, etc. are all just placeable on full grid tiles, so I think you have to get creative to get these sort of overhanging roof looks, like with pillars that are just within the borders of the grid, like these log pillars. Alright, so then for the scenery, I'm following the weird rollercoaster tycoon strategy of changing the color of the ground underneath the track and adding some foliage here and there. I don't know what the thing is with changing the ground underneath the track. It's just something that looks pretty decent. It's easy to do, but I'm gonna go back and change that a little bit later. For now though, I decided to build this second coaster, and I wasn't originally planning to build such a high-tech and modern coaster like the RMC monorail which you see here. But I left my research running for a little bit too long, and I ended up getting all of the coasters of the scenario. And I saw this thing and I just thought to myself, wow, I need to build that. I haven't built one of these things in a while, and they're one of my favorite coaster types. Also, real quick, what I'm doing here is building different heights of pieces, just so I can get a transition into that dive loop, which you normally can't do. So you can see that it sort of moves upward a little bit while it's also banking to go upside down, which is super cool. So, you know, using that sort of autocomplete function of the game, which has been added recently, you can really make all kinds of new transitions, which is really nice. But yeah, I figured to build a monorail coaster just because I really like these things, and I think it sort of fits the theme. The monorail coasters which we have so far in the world are Wonder Woman Lasso of Truth, I think it's called, and Railblazer, and they're both in the US, and they both have a sort of theme which goes alright with the theme of this park, I think. So that's sort of what my mind thinks about when I think about these coasters. So I thought, you know, why not put it in the Western Park as well? It's gonna be the one very thrilling coaster of the park, and I think it works quite well to put it out here in the back together with the drop tower. So yeah, there's the layout. I decided to have that one section which sort of sticks out and does an overbanked turn over there, because I want to fill that in with a flat ride later to have some nice interaction between the coaster and a flat ride somewhere near it as well. And then for the rest of the layouts, basically I'm trying to base this as much on the existing monorail coasters without completely stealing their layout. So you have that very signature drop where it goes down into a little curve on the top of the lift hill, and then it goes up again before it moves into a very steep drop into a dive loop. And after that it's really compact, it just kind of sticks together on a very small space and does lots of inverting elements. So yeah, very much a standard, typical Raptor layout, if you could call it that. Just in case, this is, because I always sort of assume that people know about these things, but you might not. This coaster is based on the real-life coaster by Rocky Mountain Construction. Usually people just call it RMC, and it's called the Raptor coaster, which is why I've been calling it the Raptor, even though in-game it's pretty much just the monorail coaster. But yeah, these things are real now, which is really interesting, and it's one of the most recent coaster types, really. 2018 is the first year when these things were actually built in real life, and so far it's just the one person per car version. So it's a really small coaster with a tiny track and really small cars. But there's also a 2 person per car version called the T-Rex, which hasn't been built yet, but we might get one of those things in the future. It would be really cool. It's more or less a bigger version of this coaster. So yeah, I'm also building a transfer track over here, just for that little bit of immersion, I suppose, since we will be having 2 trains on this coaster, and I thought, hey, why not build a transfer track as well? I'm keeping all of these things very simple though. I think I've got some criticism on the one that I built in the first episode, and honestly, I don't really care too much about the transfer tracks here. I just want to keep them somewhat believable, but I'm not going to go too much into detailing them because they're not actually going to have a function or anything like that, really. Now, for the scenery on this coaster, I'm pretty much doing the same thing, kind of changing the ground a little bit in a short time. I'm also adding some rock work and some foliage and some very tall fences. Normally I would put tall fences around paths whenever the coaster track is really close to the paths, because you just don't want people to climb over the fences and hurt themselves, because this thing happens actually quite a bit in real life theme parks, and a lot of the accidents that do occur in theme parks, I think, are often of people breaking the rules anyway. Now here's the flat ride that I wanted to put in this space. I had to turn on a bit more research while I was working on the coaster because I didn't have any flat ride that actually fit the space, but now we do, and it's the Magic Carpet ride, which is a bit more of a Middle Eastern ride, I suppose, but it fits, and it's a slightly desert themed ride anyway, so I figured might as well put that in there. And then behind that I'm putting up the logs as a sort of backdrop for the flat ride. And I really like making those fences with the pillars. I'm not quite sure who ever came up with that idea. It definitely wasn't me, but it's a really fun way to make your own sort of custom fences, and you can always add these little variations in the heights of the logs to make sure that they actually look somewhat natural and realistic. And it's really nice to sort of have some more flexible fences and scenery around the park. So it's definitely something that I'll be using in some of my future parks as well, whenever this sort of log fence can work out regarding the theme. Now that's basically it for the time lapse, so let's check out the park real quick. You know, I think the park is doing a little bit too well at this point. I'm almost reaching the guest goal. I have a lot of money down there, and I'm actually earning a lot of money every month as well. So I'm not quite sure if it's really too challenging anymore. But that said, I think if I build one more coaster, a really big coaster to attract a lot of guests, and a bunch of flat rides, that should be just about enough to reach the guest goal. But also enough to actually finish the park off in a nice way, because that's essentially what I'm trying to do here as well. And so far, I think this is actually one of my favorite parks of the scenario so far. It's turning out pretty well and very much like a sort of realistic, organic theme park layouts, which honestly surprised me a little bit as well, because I really never plan out these things. I just sort of do what I feel like in the spur of the moment, and this park turned out surprisingly decent. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. And the only space where I can really still expand is over here. I'm gonna, well, basically end the park at the monorail coaster over there. So really the space here is what I have left at this point. So I'm thinking of building a wooden coaster over there. Although that said, it would also be interesting to build a mine train, so I'm not quite sure what I want to try. A mine train would be something really interesting and something new to try, but I'd also like to try another GCI wooden coaster, because I sort of got an idea of how to do them with the last scenario, but because the land over here is completely empty and flat, it would be a much more interesting space to try and make my best out of it. So I'll see what I'm actually going to do. But either one of those ideas, and then combining that with a few flat rides into its own little area, I think should work. And then the park should be more or less finished. Although that said, the goal in terms of the guest count is pretty high, I've now realized. I thought it was pretty low on some of the earlier scenarios, like the scenarios so far are really quite easy. But this park really demands you to build quite a lot of flat rides and coasters until you're able to reach the goal. So little bit more of a challenge right there. Maybe the park is not much harder, but it definitely takes more time to finish than the other scenarios. In any case, let's start building. Oh god. So I decided to go for the challenge and build a mine train, which I've never actually tried before in this game, and which I knew would be much more time consuming. And part of me is also regretting that decision, because this is already becoming a really long episode, and my original ambitions was to kind of make the episodes at least something like 30 minutes or less, and that's not really happening. But I wanted to try my hand at a mine train because it just fits the theme of the park too much, and I really wanted to try building one of these. So yeah, we're going for this. Now the mine train, I think, is very much inspired by the Vekoma mine trains. It's honestly, I don't really exactly know what the standard mine train in these kinds of games are, because in real life you've sort of got the two industry leaders being Vekoma and Arrow. Arrow mine trains being more of the older ones and not all of them having the wooden planks between the tracks. And then the Vekoma ones are the sort of modern ones like Big Thunder Mountain in Disneyland Paris and the Seven Dwarfs mine train, etc. So I think it's of the latter, and because of that I decided to model it a bit like a Vekoma mine train as well. My biggest inspiration was the mine train in Walibi, Belgium, which has a very nice compact layout which doesn't use as much rockwork as the very heavily themed mine trains like Big Thunder Mountain do, but it still has the same general theme, and that's, I think, the most fitting for this scenario, because I don't think the park that I'm making in this scenario could quite, afford a Big Thunder Mountain. Honestly, barely any park in the world would, but something like this seems pretty feasible, so I'm going for a very minimalistic theming with two lift hills next together, which is sort of a Vekoma mine train thing, I suppose. Although I think at some point other mine trains started doing it too. Anyway, a basic setup in terms of a layout like that, and then the station next to it, and a little bit of interaction there. We've got the lake with the coaster having a sort of bridge over the lake, and then the queue is positioned in such a sense that you'll be very close to that, and for that most of the queue line you'll be looking at either the station itself or the sort of vista with the coaster in the foreground above the lake, and then the sort of rock work in the background. So I think as a general landscape it works pretty well. It's also a fun element to add to the coaster, because honestly I wouldn't know what kind of scenery to really add to the coaster outside of rocks and general mine detail elements. So having a bridge like this is a nice way of having some kind of, you know, memorable beat in the coaster layout, if you will, where you're going over a bridge and it's not really doing anything for a little moment. You can just sort of look around as you're in the coaster, look at the scenery, take it in, before you get smashed into that helix. And I say smashed because these things are, they're Vekoma coasters after all, so they're not really the most smooth things. So here's the rockwork, very basic. I didn't want to put rockwork around the entire track. The majority is still being held up by supports, so yeah, it's not really a big Thunder Mountain-ish coaster, but still, it sets the theme pretty well, I think, and it creates a sort of mini landscape for the coaster to go through. I also kind of want to say, and maybe this is a bit more off topic, but I wanted to talk about it anyway. My personal favorite mine train coaster, which is also a Vekoma mine train, is the Colorado Adventure in Phantasialand. It used to be known as Michael Jackson's Colorado Adventure or something like that. I'm not quite sure, because Michael Jackson opened it and the park was really proud of it, but I think they more or less got rid of that mantra. I only hear some people talk about it in that sense right now. But yeah, it's absolutely my favorite mine train, because even though it's not as well themed as other mine trains are, it's a little bit of a mess, have to be honest. There are some points where you just go through a warehouse and it interacts with the other rides in the park, but not always in the best way. But the layout is absolutely insane. It's pretty intense for a mine train. It's supposedly a family coaster, but it hits some pretty intense G's at some point. And what's also really fun about that coaster is that some of the turns are extremely overbanked. So when you think about a mine train coaster, you tend to think about these sort of kid-friendly, very smooth, gentle rides. But this thing actually kind of throws you around, and in some of those overbanked curves, it actually banks too much, like almost 90 degrees, and you just smash into the person next to you. Either that, or you get smashed into yourself by whoever's next to you. So I don't know, it's always a bit of an adventure, and that's why I really like the ride. Even though I'm usually more of a scenery kind of person, I like the combination of the setting and the pretty rough ride that it gives. So maybe this was inspired by that a little bit, but I don't think this coaster is really Colorado Adventure type intense. So for the dual lift hill, which is very much inspired by the one that you have on Walibi Belgium's mine train, I decided to put a similar roof over it as well. Just because that's also one of the only parts of the ride where I can really put a roof over it. It's a nice scenery aspect, and maybe it helps in the rain as well. I don't know. I'm not quite sure. I always feel like lift hills are the only part of a ride where I mind rain. Otherwise, I feel like rain is pretty much fine. I don't know, that's a weird little tidbit. I just remember that, you know, being on the lift hill, rain is really annoying, and being on a final brake run before you get into the station, if that doesn't have a roof over it, the rain is super annoying. But during the ride itself, it's actually, I don't know, kind of fun. I should also say that a lot of roller coasters will run faster with rain. So while most normal people will probably not want to have a rainy day when they're going to the theme park, I know a lot of coaster enthusiasts who love to ride coasters in the rain. In any case, yeah, I decided to add that cover over the lift hill, and now I'm just doing some of the other theming. I think what's really important when you're doing a scenery piece like this, when it's, you know, featuring a lot of rock work, etc., is to have some sort of transitioning scenery pieces. So around the big rocks, I'm putting smaller rocks that just sort of scatter into the landscape, and this terraforming to just kind of help transition from the rock work into the sand, so it doesn't just seem like a randomly plopped down mass of rocks, but it also just kind of, you know, transitions into the surrounding area. Having that sort of, I don't know, smooth scenery, you know, way of placing it in the context, I think is pretty important. Now here's the little final bits of filling in the theme park, because there are still some empty bits that I didn't really know what to do with. For this place, I decided to put some teacups here, because that's a flat ride that I got, and it's honestly one of the only ones that could fit in this space. But also, I feel like a lot of the rides in the park have been getting pretty intense, and it's always good to have a basic array of family rides. So yeah, teacups, here we go. And then here's the transfer track, which isn't quite, you know, the most realistic. I literally just put an S-bend of a different coaster there. Ideally, you know, in a perfect world, in a world in which this game had transfer tracks, actually, maybe this game is better off without functional ones because it's really complicated. But in any case, ideally that little track would be like a switch track, and not like a rail one where, you know, you go over the same rails, but one where it moves a little bit, so it goes from a straight piece to that sort of S-bend transition piece. These two sort of shuffle around, but you know, since we don't have that, I just put in an S-bend there, and then the building itself is pretty simple. And here is more of that sort of transitioning, which I was talking about, just putting some cacti and little rocks everywhere to blend everything together. So that's a lot of this sort of infill. Is the Ferris wheel, which, you know, if you have a body of water, I don't know, for me personally, I can never not put the Ferris wheel next to water. Sometimes it's the end of a main street or something like that, that also works. But if you've got like a little lake or a pond or something, I can't stop myself from putting a Ferris wheel there. We'll see if I can control my urges at some future episodes, but for now I'm gonna keep Ferris wheeling because I think it works pretty well. It's also one of the only rides which could really fit into that little space, so that works pretty well. And over here, I figured, you know, this is a pretty, you know, sort of far away from the entrance part of the park, and the food court is right at the entrance because that's sort of what you get from the game itself, from the scenario itself. So if people are over here and they're hungry, they don't really have anything to go to, so I decided to put a extra food court over here, and well, that's basically it. It's a really small one, it's mostly just functional. And I decided to put a very quick depot behind it, but it's super simple. You know, I'm almost trying to hide it. It's just there for food and to fill in the space which is open over here. But it's really not too much of a special building. At this point, I wanted to start finishing the scenario because it's already 6 in the evening and I still haven't made dinner yet. And you know, what am I doing still recording this? But yeah. I also didn't want to finish the park off too quickly and just have some empty bits lying around which could be improved, so I wanted to keep going until it was all filled in. And over here I'm trying to fix the scenery ratings because not every part of the path is green, so adding some more scenery here and there and hiding the backstage areas is something good to do at the end of the scenario as well, I think. And as a very, very, very final thing, actually, before that, I'm removing some of the trees because I was thinking there were too many trees for a western scenario. Gonna make it a little bit more empty. But yeah, as a final thing, I decided to add a toilet building over here because that's... I mean, there's one next to the entrance of the park and there's another one in the other food courts, but I needed to finish the main street and put a final building in. And since this part of the main street isn't really connected to those other facades, I mean, and I felt like I didn't want to make it a completely symmetrical Disney-style main street because this just isn't quite the park for that. I decided to make it just a small hut to sort of finish off the look of the town, and I think it works alright for that. So yeah, let's go and see what the park looks like in its final form. Okay, this is epic. I think it's actually my favorite park of this series so far. Definitely the best when it comes to roller coasters, and I have to be honest, making roller coasters is still my favorite part of the game. Never mind the stores which still need some supply. They'll get that eventually. But overall, I am really happy with how it turned out. Definitely a pretty natural sort of flowing layout, but with a pretty good main street, I suppose, in the middle of the park. Really happy with some of the layouts for the coasters, especially the mine train and the monorail coaster. Wild mouses are pretty much always the same anyway, so that doesn't really matter too much. And I should be getting the medal pretty soon. We should be getting some confetti. There we go! Alright, so we've completed all of the goals. We didn't do it by December year 2. Frankly, we're in year 6 already. God. But yeah, that's awesome. So I am definitely going to put some of this stuff as blueprints on the Steam Workshop. Reminder that also the coasters from the first and second episode of the series are also on my workshop page, and you can find them in the descriptions of the videos. So if you want to check that out, definitely scroll down there. And I definitely want to blueprint this thing. It's a pretty decent layout, I think, for the coaster type, even if it's sort of very much built for the park, considering the pathway that goes here and the flat ride, which is over here. But even then, I think it's a decent monorail coaster layout. The Wild Mouse is pretty standard, but maybe yeah, it's worth it for the station. And the mine train, I don't know, that's going to be a little bit difficult. Wait, are those things... Oh, okay, no, never mind. That was actually a block break issue. Ah, that's interesting. Because it sort of held on to the end of the lift hill, going slower and slower, just to make sure that it wasn't on the same block as this train. But because of that, they couldn't be synchronized. So that's a bit of a shame. But still, the interaction between the two trains is really cool. So yeah, I'm thinking about putting the mine train up, but obviously I can't have it up with the pond over here as well. But even then, with all of the rock work and stuff, it's definitely worth putting up on the workshop. Oh, and it's broken. I might not have enough staff, or at least not enough mechanics. Yeah, just 4 mechanics. I sort of have to get used to how much staff I have to get more, because in my first scenarios I had way too little staff, and I still might have not enough. So definitely like 1 janitor or 1 mechanic more should do the trick. But so far the parks are running alright, and there's no stuff on the ground, well, except for the little bit of vomit over here. So I think I'm doing alright. And then over here, the little kiddie coaster, which doesn't have a name yet. I'm gonna have to find some decent names for some of these rides before I put them up. But I'm pretty happy with this as well. It's quite similar to the other coasters, but still looks pretty good, I think. So yeah, that's it for this park. Not too much else to look at anymore, I suppose. So I'm really glad I did this scenario. It's actually my favorite scenario to play so far as well, just because it's such a sandbox. It might be a little bit more difficult than the other scenarios in terms of the goals that you have, but then the map itself is very much just a sort of desert sandbox where you can do whatever you want, but you can sort of pick up the theme which the scenario starts with. So yeah, that's quite nice. Let's save this and quit to see what else we're gonna get. So if I'm right, I should be getting Coral Caldera and be able to play that next time, but I don't know if it's also gonna already show the next scenario, which I don't have enough coins for yet. Alright, so we get the trophy, so that's nice. And we get 1 coin, and that'll be it then, I suppose. Yeah, we just get an extra pathway to Coral Island, where we're gonna do the next scenario. So the next scenario is gonna be Coral Caldera, which is gonna be one that I made again, and we're gonna have to sell 800 park tickets and have an overall park rating of at least 70%. Alright, so that's not too difficult. And then actually the optional goal is to have 400 park tickets, so that's just sort of an extra, I guess, some kind of coaster or new ride or money that you get halfway during the scenario. And then the optional goal is to complete all of the non-optional goals by December year 2, but we all know I'm not going to make that. I'm actually going to want to put a lot of effort into this one, because this is honestly one of my favorite scenarios which I've made. So yeah, I'm really going to try and put some effort into this map again. In any case, that'll be it for today, so thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you guys next episode.